Aliens Explored is a podcast exploring famous and obscure cases of UFO sightings, alien abductions and other strange events from both a believing and a sceptical perspective whilst keeping an open mind. I'm Stu Jackson, a professional actor and amateur ufologist with a particular interest in the crop circle phenomenon. I'll be debating that otherworldly visitations are real. The truth is out there.
And I'm Neil Kelly. I'm a professional actor as well and used to work for the military as an intelligence analyst. I'll be arguing from a more doubtful point of view. I mean, it's all a bit far-fetched, isn't it?
On September the 19th, 1961, around 10:30 p.m, Betty and Barney Hill were driving back to Portsmouth from a vacation in Niagara Falls and Montreal. Barney was employed by the United States Postal Service, while Betty was a social worker. Both were active in the local Unitarian congregation, and Barney sat on a local board of the United States Commission on Civil Rights. They were an interracial couple at a time when it was particularly uncommon in the United States. Barney was African American and Betty was white. When travelling just south of Lancaster, New Hampshire, Betty claimed to have observed a bright point of light in the sky and reasoned that she was observing a falling star. When travelling just south of Lancaster, New Hampshire, Betty claimed to have observed a bright point of light in the sky and reasoned that she was observing a falling star, only it moved upwards and appeared to be getting bigger. Betty urged Barney to stop the car for a closer look, so Barney stopped at a scenic picnic area just south of Twin Mountain. Looking through binoculars, Betty saw an odd-shaped craft flashing multicoloured lights travel across the face of the moon and thought she might be seeing a flying saucer. Barney reasoned it was a commercial airliner travelling toward Vermont on its way to Montreal. However, he soon changed his mind because, without looking as if it had turned, the craft rapidly descended in his direction. This observation caused Barney to realise this object that was a plane was not a plane. They quickly returned to the car and drove towards Franconia Notch, a narrow mountainous stretch of the road. Approximately 1 mile south of Indian Head, they said the object rapidly descended towards their vehicle, causing Barney to stop in the middle of the highway. The huge silent craft hovered approximately 80 to 100 feet above their car and filled the entire field of view in the windshield. Barney stepped away from the vehicle and moved closer to the object, where he claimed to have seen about 8 to 11 humanoid figures through the craft's windows, wearing glossy black uniforms and black caps. Barney ran back to his car and in a near hysterical state he told Betty, "They're going to capture us." He saw the object again shift its location to directly above the vehicle. He drove away at high speed, telling Betty to look for the object. She rolled down the window and looked up. Almost immediately the Hills heard a rhythmic series of beeping or buzzing sounds, which they said seemed to bounce off the trunk of their vehicle. The car vibrated and a tingling sensation passed through the Hills' bodies. The Hills said that they then experienced the onset of an altered state of consciousness that left their minds dulled. A second series of beeping or buzzing sounds returned the couple to full consciousness. They found that they had travelled nearly 35 miles south, but had only vague, spotty memories of this section of road. Hi everyone and welcome to Aliens Explored. I'm Stu Jackson and I'm here today with
Neil Kelly.
Hello Neil, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, really, really good. So this might not be the case for the listeners, but we're actually still in lockdown, so we're actually doing this over the phone, aren't we?
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, today is the day when people have started coming out and going back to school, and I thought, well, I don't know when you'll be listening to this, but that's what's happening as we're recording this. And the scientific advice seems to be that we're all going to end up back in lockdown, right back to square one for another 3 months as a result.
That's certainly the opinion. And it's interesting, before we get into this particular case that we're going to talk about today, which is Betty and Barney Hill, I'm going to be very, very interested to see if the lockdown and our current situation affects the crop circle phenomenon.
That will be...
Because for years and years...
I was going to say, yeah, that will be interesting. I suppose a few years back, well, probably quite a lot of years back, some hoaxers came forward and said that they'd made them all. And of course, if that is true, if you're doing it with a bit of rope and a plank and tramping down someone's crops, well, I suppose you can do that socially. You can do that from a safe social point of view, can't you? From a social distancing perspective. That is one thing you can safely do.
But I think, I'm inclined to think that if, and it's a big if, and hopefully we'll cover some crop circles in future episodes because it's a real passion of mine. I don't believe for one moment. I believe that there are some crop circles that are made by humans. I think that is absolutely correct. But I think the majority are not. But that's a whole different topic. But if, as the media would have you believe, all crop circles are made by human beings, then they've got to be affected. We'd see a massive drop in the number of crop circles because of the current situation.
I don't know, would we? Because they occur in rural areas, don't they? So it's quite easy to just jump in your car and go out at night and go and make a crop circle. It doesn't... The fact that people are locked down in their houses, in fact, it makes it easier for you, doesn't it? You're less likely to be discovered doing it.
Well, that's... don't know, because anybody out and about are more likely to get spotted and picked up or questioned and things like that. From a believer perspective, there is another side to this, of course, which, as you absolutely rightly say, it happens quite a lot in rural areas. In fact, it usually happens within sort of 20 miles of where I am at the moment. It happens an awful lot around Wiltshire.
Well, by definition, if it's happening to a crop, then it's a rural area.
No, they don't just appear in crops, but that's a whole other. They appear in ice, they appear in sand. That's a very that's a whole other trail. That is an entire other episode, or indeed series, right there. But no, I think because they are happening so rural, it takes people to spot them for us to know about their existence. And indeed, crop circles can appear and be there for days without anyone being aware of them. That's not unheard of. So if there are fewer people about, even if they aren't being created by human hand, then we still might see a dip in the reporting of them, just by the fact that they're going unnoticed.
But also, isn't there must be a seasonal aspect to them, because crops are planted at a certain time of year in the spring and they're harvested in the autumn. So it's got to be a kind of late summer, early autumn kind of phenomenon, hasn't it, when the crops are there?
There is a seasonal aspect, you're absolutely right. They have a tendency to start appearing in May and go through till August. So now is the time that we would start to see a surgence, or within the next week or so, because we're recording this the beginning of June. Yeah, you would have. Yeah, you would have normally. Actually, you would have normally seen a few by now, but I've not heard of it. It doesn't mean to say they're not out there just because I haven't heard of them. I'm not omnipotent.
But I would imagine
Much as
farmers.
I might tell my partner.
I imagine farmers tending to their crops would have noticed them.
Yes, but you say tending, they don't go out to them daily. And certainly on the bigger farms, you can go weeks without. That's the great thing about crops. You plant them, our weather waters them quite regularly, or quite often on farms they have automatic watering systems. Yeah, they only go out to them if there's a problem, usually.
So who typically spots them then? If farmers aren't going out and seeing
depending
them?
on their location, they're either seen from the roadside. You might see them in the distance as you're driving past, or very often it's aircraft pilots who report them.
I was going to say, people flying light aircraft or gliding clubs, paragliders, they're going to notice things like that, aren't they? They've got the best view of it.
Well, and ironically, across vast rural landscapes is where you get quite a prevalence of light aircraft. Because that's where it's most fun to fly, I suppose, where it's most picturesque.
Absolutely. Sorry?
No, go on.
Yeah, if you've got people learning to fly, they're doing their basic pilot's license, which is not without its risks. You probably don't want them flying over urban areas, do you? As much as possible.
Many years ago for my 40th birthday, but in spite of the fact I've got an absolute morbid fear of flying, my then, now ex-partner got me a flying lesson for my 40th birthday. No, we did actually go over urban areas. But I was terrified to turn the plane or anything. It was.
But you went through with it. You did it.
Yeah, I gritted my teeth, and I think
I
she got me that because that's what she wanted to do.
Yeah, I once had a helicopter lesson. I was travelling in New Zealand, and this bloke came up to me and he said, "Do you want to go up in my helicopter, and you can hang out of it with a shotgun and go and shoot something? We'll just sort of fly over and shoot something." And I said, "Well, no, I don't really fancy that, but I wouldn't mind." But he said, "Well, how about a lesson then?" He said it's quite easy to fly, and so I said, "Yeah, okay." And it was this tiny little craft. It was this basically we sort of carried it out the hang. It was on a pallet, and we just sort of carried it out the hangar. And he did the takeoff. And with a helicopter, you have to kind of take off like a plane. You have to sort of fly down the runway at a low level and then take off like a plane. Otherwise, you'll terrify the people in the control tower when you just suddenly appear on their radar. They have to actually see you taking off. And it was easier to fly than I'd been led to believe. I thought, well, this is easy because you've got a handle next to you that's like a handbrake in a car, and when you pull that up, you go up, and when you let it down, you go down. You've got the two pedals in front of you which kind of turn it, and you've got a sort of joystick which enables you to steer it when you're actually going along. So it is possible to crab sideways in a helicopter with the combination of pedals and gear stick. And I thought, well, this is easy. And then he said, okay, well, let's try hovering then. Just hover at this bit, and that's really difficult. That's a really difficult thing because it's so sensitive. You feel yourself drifting, so you compensate because you slightly overcompensate. The next thing, you're flying down the runway at 50 miles an hour. You call that hovering?
That sounds like absolutely terrifying. You realise just listening to that, I'm sweating.
and it was an unbelievably small craft. We were like the two of us were in a smart car together. Imagine a smart car with a little tail and a rotor above it. That's pretty much what it was.
Yeah, that helps. Okay. I think I had a drink of water now. But it's interesting you say about the radar tower, and they don't want you suddenly appearing on the radar because it'll terrify them. No, because they're so used to seeing UFOs.
Well, yeah.
Anyway.
Suddenly, and you literally are a UFO, aren't you?
Oh yeah,
In the truest definition.
Absolutely. Well, in the
Yeah.
definitive definition, yes. So on that note, I'm going to use that as a segue to bring us into our topic today, which is the Betty and Barney Hill case.
Yes.
From way back in the day, 1961. Now, this is an interesting case because this is the first, certainly widely reported UFO abduction case, and it's got a lot of fame and notoriety from that particular aspect. But obviously we've gone out and we've done our own little reading up on this in advance of the podcast. So as our resident naysayer and skeptic, or I think that might be a bit strong. It's fair to say certainly that you're new to this world of aliens and strange occurrences.
Yeah.
But what was the first thing that struck you about this case?
I think actually the first thing that struck me was that in 1961 they were a mixed race couple travelling together. That kind of, I'd always tended to think of UFO abductions as affecting sort of very rural people, white people, single white men who lived in rural areas, and also coincidentally had a previously existing obsession with UFOs and the paranormal and such, and then suddenly they report that they've been abducted. So here we have what was, as you say, it was the first really. It was the case that set the tone for all the alien abductions, and it happened to a couple. The other thing that struck me, I suppose, other things I've got to consider. This is there's a military intelligence aspect coming in. One thing you know if you're making a report of intelligence is the more far from the truth, or the further from someone's prior expectations your information is, the less likely they are to believe it. If you're telling a general that there's an enemy regiment over the other side of the hill, and he'd already thought they're pretty much. If you're confirming what he already thought, yeah, he'll believe that without a doubt. If you tell him that, oh, actually, it's 10 divisions, it's a whole army over there, he might not believe you. He'll want to verify it. So I think with the whole UFO thing, when someone reports that they've been abducted or they've had some kind of contact with extraterrestrials, that the first reaction is to look for possible down-to-earth explanations of what was going on, and there usually are all sorts of other factors. I mean, I think the first thing about UFO contacts or these experiences that they rely on eyewitness accounts, which are the least reliable form of information. In those days, people didn't have camera phones or anything. That's a very, very recent phenomenon. So it was just their word for it. Another aspect of this case is that although for a long while they were puzzled about what had happened, they'd seen this strange light in the sky. They'd become dopey and then woke. They'd been driving along in their car, but then they somehow lost consciousness and then woke up 35 miles from where they'd last checked, further down the road. With their watches had stopped, Barney's shoes were strangely scuffed, and Betty's dress was ripped, and 2 hours that neither one of them could remember. What is another suspicious aspect of it is that when they did remember, it was through sort of hypnotism, through recovered memory, which, as you know, has had a very bad press in recent years, being used to convince children that their parents were Satanists who'd abused them in all sorts of unbelievable ways.
Yes.
So it's quite a discredited way of getting information out. So there are these aspects. There's also, I think, the time in our history when it happened. It happened in 1961, at a time when the world was, for one thing, fascinated with space. We had just started sending men up into space. I think Yuri Gagarin had been into orbit by this time, and the Americans were racing to catch up. So space had suddenly become threatening. Basically, the enemy had managed to put things up there. But also, this is something that had been going on since the 1950s, or since the jet age, the atomic age. You notice it with horror films, the kinds of things that scared people in those days. In the 1930s and 40s, It was all sort of Frankenstein, Dracula, the Wolfman, that kind of thing. Suddenly, in the 1950s, all the horror is based on alien invaders. It becomes very, very...
absolutely. Or nuclear was the other one.
Yeah,
like an atomic bomb goes off and all the ants are suddenly, 50 foot tall, that kind of thing. But now I would ascribe that, and I think that's a very important point, that it's only in relatively recent years, because there have been reports of strange things in the skies for hundreds, even thousands of years. But it's only recently that we've talked about them being from space. But that's... So if you look back 1,000 years ago, when people were obsessed or ascribed anything they didn't understand to being, well, that's the will of God or that kind of thing. So everything was given that label, or it's a devil, it's a demon, Now, if you like, space has become the new God. It's the thing that we all focus on, as you rightly say. So that becomes our automatic answer. It's the box that we automatically put it in. Now, as much as I'm a believer, at no point do I say, okay, it's aliens from another planet. I think there are other possibilities than just that one. And in fact, I believe that the truth is going to be much stranger than anything anybody can imagine. But coming back to what you pointed out, you say the first thing that struck you was the fact that they're a mixed race couple.
Yeah.
And in 1961, in 1961 in particular, that was not a terribly common occurrence.
No, I mean they weren't living in the deep South, but it was still the age of segregation. It was before the civil rights movement. It was a difficult time to be in that kind of relationship.
Well, they were, interestingly, it's, I think, unsurprising given their personal circumstance, but it's certainly interesting that they were both civil rights advocates. Now, looking at the case from a purely investigative point of view, you look at the motive, the means, and the opportunity. Now, in terms of motive, do you think the fact that they were an interracial couple harmed their motive for... Let's argue that maybe they created it all, but wouldn't that harm their situation, make them less credible within society?
Well, not so much them being less, maybe less credible, but I'm also thinking if a mixed race couple in America at that time would want to keep a low profile. They wouldn't want to suddenly go to the press with a made up story that gets their picture on the front pages of the papers. That's because there'll be a lot of people who'd see the story and they'd see the picture, and the picture will be all they'd take away from it. There's this mixed race couple living in our town, and maybe something ought to be done about it.
So they'd want to avoid the attention and again, a lot of people, when they say, "Oh yeah, so and so's been abducted," but claims to have been abducted by it, they're just doing it for attention. In fact, that attention would have been more harmful to them.
It would have been, but people do things that are harmful to themselves, don't they? They do things where you say, well, that makes no sense. They can't even give you a good reason why they've done it. They'll just get angry if you start questioning the logic of their decision.
But there doesn't seem to be any history of that with them as a couple. I mean, Betty was a social worker. Barney was worked for the post office.
Yeah.
They were strong, grounded community people. They, like I say, they were both civil rights advocates, and they worked very hard. I think Barney was on the local board of a civil rights commission. When we look at motor, why would a person make something like this up?
Well,
I'm
actually,
struggling to think of any reason why they would.
Here's one. I'll float this one by you. They both had quite stressful jobs. As a social worker and as a post office worker, they're probably not earning that much. And this is the beginning of the age of television as well. And they might have seen people appear on television and get a lot of adulation and fame and sponsorship, and suddenly they become very, very rich, or much better off than they are. There could have been a financial motive to it. Let's just make up this story and become celebrities and be on TV a lot, be paid to be on TV. We're 1961. You're right at the beginning of that kind of age of television celebrity.
Now you mentioned about the famous situation where they were questioned under hypnosis.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that? I mean, as much as hypnosis is, it's discredited and it's not considered a certainly from a legal standpoint.
Yeah, recovered memory is very dodgy indeed.
Yeah, I mean, I know it can be guided quite easily, but given, and again, coming back to this idea, it's 1961. You've got to think in 1961 terms. Some of the things, particularly Barney, mentioned in his abduction recollection, the anal probe exists, for example. The fact that he thought a sample of his sperm had been taken. I'm inclined to think that if they were going to make it up just for fame, it wouldn't include that kind of detail. You wouldn't want to just be known for that. Not in 1961, when everybody is still much more uptight and less open about these things. I find that a strange, because that if you were going to make it up, the first thing you would think is, well, hang on a minute, that sort of thing, even if it occurred to you to say, that's going to, what are people going to say about me?
But the thing is, they are going to say something about it. They'll take a prurient interest. Oh, you were anally probed. You were sexually abused. That's interesting, isn't it? And all right, people do bare their souls on television. You say, there's a television program where people who are too embarrassed to go to the doctor with a problem appear on television and show it. I've forgotten what the program is called.
Okay.
Yeah, I've only become aware of it. I don't really watch it, but there is that. Yeah, if you want the story to sell, you need to spice it up a bit, don't you? So I guess an anal probe will do that. And it's become part of UFO lore, hasn't it? All these people have been abducted and had been anally probed for some reason.
Well, part of that is the media fixating on that aspect. Obviously, there are many cases of alien abductions that don't include that kind of thing. But I mean, it's not the only case. That's absolutely true. But that is more of a media fixation.
And all the things that were done to them, are all things that either wouldn't be noticed or could be explained away. They they plucked strands of their hair, took clippings of their nails, and scraped their skin. Barney's shoes were scuffed. Betty's dress was torn. Well, I can think of all sorts of ways those kinds of things can happen.
Absolutely.
With a couple travelling. There's nothing to say. Well, I mean, if the aliens had done something to them, if they'd implanted some kind of device that enhanced them, or fixed a medical condition that was beyond terrestrial medicine, that would be something. But that's never happened, has it? No one's ever come back and say, look, I'm going to live to be 250 years old because the aliens have done something to the way my body ages.
Okay.
No one's ever come back and said, look, I've got this more advanced pacemaker for my heart now.
No. Well, okay. Moving away briefly from the Betty and Barney Hill case, there are many, many, many thousands of cases of people with implants that have come back from what they claim is alien abductions with things implanted into them.
Really? They found these implants?
Yes. Well, we'll cover those in a future episode.
Yeah,
I think you might find that interesting.
Obviously, I've got a bit of reading to do.
Oh, you've got so much reading to do. I envy you. So, okay. Do you know what? All right, I can accept the idea that they've created this story to gain fame and a bit of fortune. But another place where it falls down for me is the idea that they didn't go out and seek any. They were very open about their experience, and they would talk about it plainly with people who asked. But they didn't go out and seek any fame or fortune from it.
Well, they must have told someone, because they're famous and they're down as the model for an alien abduction. Something. I mean, the
first place they discussed it openly was at their church, and that was a good year and a half later, something like that.
Yeah.
That was their first public. The first time they that it's known of that they talked to anybody about it privately. There was a guy from the Air Force who visited the church that they attended. And I believe, Barney spoke to him in private afterwards. But that was November 1962. So that's over a year later. So surely this event happens to them, or they claim this event happens. Why would they either wait over a year before talking to anyone and wait nearly 2 years before talking publicly about it? Or alternatively, why would they make it up and say it happened really long ago?
Yeah. And also the fact that it's in church. I mean, I know Americans are generally more religious than us Europeans. They're more likely to go to church. So I guess the fact they're going to church and telling their story and going to Bible classes doesn't necessarily mean that they're religious fanatics. It perhaps in the same way
no.
in England, but it could be that their story was seen as blasphemous. I mean, maybe it started out as we felt the presence of the Lord kind of story. This bright white light, the Virgin Mary, and maybe it started out as the Virgin Mary and then became a flying saucer.
Oh, apparently it was a terrifying experience. I don't think they would have seen it as a positive celestial encounter. A negative religious experience, that's a different hypothesis, but certainly I don't think they would have seen it as being anything benevolent.
But church, when it basically the main the main document you're referring to is the Bible, which was written at a time when virtually nothing was known beyond our world, that people genuinely did believe we were at the centre of the universe, everything rotated around us. It was official doctrine. It was blasphemy to say otherwise. The vastness of the heavens was unknown. Well, when this happened, 1961, we're just at the beginning of the age when astronomers knew more about the vastness of space, but it's just coming into the public consciousness just how big space is, that all those stars you see out there are basically, the sun is a star, and all those stars you see are other suns, all potentially with solar systems of planets around them. And we know, because we've done it, that it is possible to travel in space. And that we're developing better and better ways to do it. They're talking about going to the moon. They probably started talking about that at this time.
When did Kennedy announce that, make his promise that man would get to it? It was round about then, wasn't it?
It would have been, yes, because the Soviets were the first. They were the first to put an object into orbit with the Sputnik. They had the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin. So I guess the Americans had to be first at something. So they decided, well, we'll be the first to get to the moon. I mean, apparently, a little aside here, declassified Soviet documents that have been released show that Yuri Gagarin wasn't the first man into space. He was about the fifth.
Right.
But he was the first one to come back in one piece. And the guy before him, who I think survived, he lived for a while, but he was he was totally busted up, was a guy called Ilyushin, who was the grandson of the Ilyushin aircraft designer. So, but I mean, the reason the Russians were able to get into space faster than the Americans was because they were willing to take bigger risks with the lives of their cosmonauts, and they were happy to send them up with a rocket fired by liquid fuel. The Americans weren't. They were taking their time to develop a safer solid fuel. So it's not a surprise to hear that in taking these risks, those risks were actually realised, that they lost a few cosmonauts before they got one into orbit. So
interesting.
Yeah. Well, the Russians hadn't worked out how to land a capsule. When a capsule came back from space, they didn't know how to slow it down. That it would be coming through the atmosphere faster than a bullet, several times faster than a bullet, thousands of miles per hour, and they couldn't slow it down. I mean, if you just try and open a parachute on it, that's just going to rip off. And it was the Americans who actually developed the retro rockets that would, cause a reverse thrust, which would slow the capsule down enough so that a parachute could be deployed without being immediately torn to pieces. Russian cosmonauts had to climb out of their capsule and jump. They had to come down on their own parachute. That was the only way they needed to do it. And you can imagine the speed they're travelling at. But the parachute would be sturdy enough to arrest the weight of a human being travelling at that speed, where they couldn't arrest the weight of a space capsule.
We've digressed.
We have digressed, yes. It's very difficult to stay on topic.
Oh no, and digression is good.
Because there are so many aspects to it. Yeah, we're talking about all the sort of cultural references, all the scientific references, psychiatric references. That's why the Betty and Barney Hill story still fascinates, because it does contain all these elements, all these different explanations.
One of the things that we can refute, interestingly, we said just now that it might be they made up the story and made it up to be in the past.
Yeah.
We can actually refute that because just after it happened, they reported it to their local Air Force base.
That's right, yes, because they were frightened they'd been exposed to radiation.
Yeah, there's that element. There's they didn't want to give all the details at first, apparently, because of fear of ridicule. But subsequently did on various interviews with the Air Force Base. It was Peace Air Force Base was their local one. So that means, yes, they reported it. So either they make it up or it happens, kind of one or the other. They report it to a US Air Force base. Otherwise, keep quiet about it. A year later, Barney talks to a visiting Air Force official in his church about it, but on the quiet. And quite some time after that is when they talk about it openly in their church. So there's quite a gap of time. So again, coming back to this theory that maybe they did it for fame and fortune, why would they wait so long?
Well, the explanation that springs to mind is if they made it up for fame and fortune, that means it never happened, that nothing happened to them back in September 1961. So the first time they started telling a story about some light in the sky was a year later, and maybe they just, they developed the story, they embellished it over time, so by 1964 they had a tale to tell. But obviously they're going to set it way back when they were on this. When did you see this? Well, where's a time when we were out together on a lonely road with no one else around, no one else who can deny our claims or contradict us? Well, yes, it was when we were coming back from our honeymoon in September 1961, and we were just racing home to try and beat a hurricane that was on its way. So if you take that, then there's not such a time lag. It's the time lag when they first speak to an Air Force officer about some phenomenon in the sky, to a few years later when they suddenly come up with the fully developed story. I mean, writers of fiction do that, don't they? They'll come up with an idea and they'll mull on it, and then suddenly one morning they'll wake up and think, oh, I've got a story.
But why? So that's fact. But the day or a day or two after the event, they reported it to their Air Force base. And there's a record of that. It's report 100-1-61 Air Intelligence Information Record. There you go.
Okay.
Get all the facts on this show. So there is a record of them reporting it. So again, why that? So they haven't
reported something.
It was a while before they put it in the past.
It was a while before they were helped to remember that they'd actually been in an alien craft, wasn't it? And used helped to remember in inverted commas. But, Barney Hill was a World War II veteran, wasn't he? He was an Air Force veteran, very interested in aircraft, an avid plane spotter. I think it would take quite something for most people to go to an Air Force base and report something. But if they were looking... they'd seen something in the sky. Because remember, this was also a time of great Cold War paranoia. When was the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Oh,
well, that was a year or so later, wasn't it?
That's a good question.
The Bay of Pigs fiasco was in 1961.
That was October 62. Yeah.
So the following year you got the
Bay of Pigs was just before this happened. This was in April of the year it happened.
So for a couple of years, America had suddenly found itself with a hostile neighbour, albeit a neighbour that doesn't really have the capability of doing them much harm at this stage. They've tried to bring it back into the American fold because it's now firmly in the Soviet camp. And that attempt has catastrophically failed I think that had quite even though it wasn't an official American military operation, it was a bunch of Cuban mercenaries basically who were trying to depose Castro. But I think Americans still felt a sense of it. Certainly, the mafia felt a sense of it, didn't it? Because Havana was their kind of offshore playground, their gambling centre, the Playboys' playground at that time, and that had been lost. So it was kind of on the American radar. I think planes used to get hijacked as well. Planes would get hijacked and taken to Cuba, wouldn't they?
Well, yeah, but also very much on the radar with the military at the time. Was UFOs were well, you had Project Blue Book going at the time, which was the Air Force's study into the UFO phenomenon, which it was being taken very, very seriously by the military and by the government.
Yeah, but I think there's a correlation between the numbers of UFO sightings or extraterrestrial experiences and the general level of public interest in those things, which was, it was peaking it was coming to the fore for the first time, and there were very real world threats around. The skies were no longer safe. The Russians could get into orbit. The Russians had taken a Caribbean, taken over a Caribbean country as they probably saw it. The threat was very close, and nuclear weapons, of course, were now part of the everyday conversation. Yeah, the next war was going to be a war of annihilation, and then there's all this science fiction that's all the horror. Every time they went into a drive-in movie and watched a horror movie, it would be about aliens coming to land in flying saucers. And then suddenly they see a flying saucer, have contact with aliens. So there's that. I think this will probably be for a later discussion, but certainly interest in certainly UFO spottings seem to have declined, or one commentator said since 9/11, because suddenly people are worried about something else.
In actual fact, no, they've increased massively in the last few years.
Okay, well, you've read a different report.
Yeah. And certainly video footage has increased massively along with it. Yeah, definitely a different report, and that will be interesting to discuss. Yeah. Compare reports.
Because you think the video footage, I mean, that puts a higher burden of proof on someone who spotted a UFO. You can't just come in from the fields and say you saw a strange light in the sky, or you had a video camera on you. Why didn't you get some footage? So yeah, if they're increasing, then that's a strong argument in their favour, isn't it?
But that's the thing, though. These reports have been happening all the way through, but they've been ascribed to different things depending on what's on the. Yeah, I mean, you're right. A lot of people during that time would see UFOs and think it's the commies, kind of thing. So yeah, it's a big thing. So let's summarise what we think about Betty and Barney Hill then. So for me, all right, I get your point that it's possible their motive for creating this was for fame and glory, but it just this time frame of when they talked about it publicly and it happening, it's too long for me. I don't see the sense in why they would sit on it for so long. Add to that as well the Air Force. If they didn't believe what the Hills said when it was first reported to them, they believed that they were telling the truth. And we're not talking about secret agents here getting one over on military personnel. We're talking about normal, upstanding members of the community. So that I don't know. I'm of the belief that they do believe what happened to them happened. I think perhaps over the course of time, their memory of what happened to them might have become a little bit muddied and swayed by media or books that they've read. There's a whole thing we've not discussed about Betty having a recurring dreams about the incident that might have swayed. Certainly Betty's memory of it, or her talking about her dreams, might have influenced Barney's recollection. I'm more than happy to accept that it might not be the way they tell the story, in full, but I'm also, you've got things like the damage to Betty's dress. There wasn't just the tear in it. There was this alleged pink powder that she noticed on it and then washed off, but it left damage on the dress, and then the dress is then sent for examination.
But that's convenient, isn't it? There was some evidence, but I washed it down the drain.
But that's what people would do. There's
probably what they would have
done.
Probably what they would have done then. But I think now, especially with all the sort of CSI programs or whatever, if someone had an experience like that and had some memory of it, and there was some substance that they couldn't explain or identify on their clothes, they would keep that, wouldn't they? They'd put the clothes into a plastic bag.
Oh, absolutely, and indeed they do. The kind of like a Monica Lewinsky kind of.
Yeah, and especially if they were worried that they'd been exposed to radiation, that you've suddenly got this unexplained material on your clothes. Well, that could be radioactive dust.
That could be seen as an argument for wanting to wash it off as quickly as possible,
or an argument for not being able to. It's a hole in your story. And you've got to somehow fill it by saying, "Oh well, I didn't really think. I just washed it off." And I think
it is, but there's so like I say, summarising this back up then. So there's all these little bits of things that pile up. There's the damage to the car, that suddenly making compasses go haywire when they come near it. All these little things just adds up. I think something happened to them, and I think it was something not entirely unlike what they've described, but possibly that's just been muddied over time. Yeah. But it leaves me believing that they're absolutely telling the truth.
I think on a scale, at one end of the scale, it's what happened is exactly as they described it. That's a full and true account of what happened, all the way down the scale to nothing happened at all, and they made it up for whatever reason. Yeah, it probably is somewhere in the middle. Something happened to them, but there are all sorts of other factors by which they would interpret or understand what happened to them. So, I think as we said in our introduction to this program. I'm less likely to accept their version of things than you are, but I can accept that something happened to them.
Do you think that something was otherworldly?
Possibly. I mean, we know now that there are billions of planets out there, and billions capable of supporting life in the solar system. We know that space travel is possible. So, yeah, who knows? We have landed on other planets, so it's got to be feasible that someone's landed on ours. It's just. I think of it. If you think of it in religious terms, Christians fully accept that a virgin gave birth to a child. If a virgin came into their church now and said, a woman came into their church now and said, "Oh, I'm pregnant, but I'm a virgin," she wouldn't be believed.
No.
So it's I'll believe it in this context. I'll believe it in this story, but I don't believe it when I see it face to face. And you would think, well, even if Mary was a virgin and gave birth to a godlike child, who would have believed her? Unless there was a sort of cult of people ready to believe it, who've been waiting for this. Unless it's a story that's already going around. It's already some kind of legend. And I think that with the UFO thing, the ground was primed for this.
Okay, so very much then, the jury's out on Betty and Barney Hill. Why not send us a tweet, Facebook message or a Facebook post and tell us what you think. Are there any particular aspects of the story we've glossed over? Anything that we've misinterpreted? Do feel free to share with us. I hope you enjoyed listening. Don't forget to listen again, where we will be discussing the Phoenix Lights. Thank you very much. I'm Stu Jackson.
I'm Neil Kelly.
And we'll see you next time.
Look forward to it. Bye. Aliens Explored is a Feagle Films production in association with Juicy Falls. Music by hooksounds.com and editing by Stu Jackson. Find us on Facebook and Twitter or by visiting aliensexplored.com.